It's Thursday, the 5th of March, 2026. Welcome to the Fast 5 Business News by Fear and Greed, where we give you the top 5 business stories you need to know in just 5 minutes. I'm Michael Thompson, and good morning, Sean Aylmer.
Good morning, Michael.
Sean, 5 stories in 5 minutes. And before we get going, a reminder, hit follow on the podcast if you haven't already. I've been talking about it for weeks, so you probably already have. But if you haven't, and you're listening through Spotify and through the Your Daily Drive playlist, that playlist is going to disappear very soon, which makes it harder to find the Fast 5. So hit follow so you can keep hearing us every day. On with the show, Sean. Story number 1. The Australian economy ended last year growing at its fastest pace since 2022, boosted by government spending, boosted by data centre investment, and boosted by a bit of a Black Friday shopping spree by consumers. The annual rate of growth jumped to 2.6% last calendar year, up from 2.1% 3 months earlier. This is according to the Bureau of Stats. For the quarter, the economy expanded at a 0.8% clip, which is faster than economists expected, and it was spread across both the public and private sectors and adds a bit of weight to arguments that the Reserve Bank will lift interest rates when it meets in less than a fortnight. Kind of broadly, the data shows that the economy rebounded strongly, right, in the second half of last year.
Very true, but in economics there are always caveats. Private business investment, bit lackluster. That's important for future growth. Consumer spending also tapering, still adding to the economy, but it was actually much stronger in the June quarter than it was by the end of the year. Households account for about half of total GDP, total economic growth, so that slowdown is significant. Household savings rate ticked up to nearly 7%. That suggests some degree of caution among consumers. Treasurer Jim Chalmers, who's been under fire for the big spending by the federal government, said the figures show the pickup in private sector activity and overall good news for the economy, particularly in uncertain times.
What does it mean for interest rates then, Sean? And you mentioned Jim Chalmers there. What about pressure on the government to reduce spending so that interest rates don't go up more than they actually have to?
Yeah, so household consumption was below forecast, but the number was really messy. Things like legal tobacco sales mucking it up. The fact that AC/DC, Metallica, Oasis concerts through November last year, lots of people spent money on that and the Ashes. So it just looks like people's discretionary spending is high. Public sector, you mentioned, nearly 28% of the economy, record level, no matter what the Treasurer says. Public spending is high. It is adding to interest rate pressures. What's it mean? Well, there could be a rate rise next, or March 17th, in 2 weeks' time, or a bit less than that. More likely, there will be one in May, Michael.
Okay. Sean, story number 2, the local share market yesterday experienced its worst sell-off since April last year, since the Liberation Day tariffs were introduced. The benchmark S&P ASX 200 closed down nearly 2% yesterday to 8,901 points. The fall in the local market followed Wall Street tumbling by as much as 2% yesterday. There's fears of a spike in inflation translating to less chance of rate cuts in the US, in the world's biggest economy.
Yeah, so analysts believe the conflict could be more drawn out than first hoped for. Locally, all 11 sub-indices fell yesterday, led by materials, including the mining companies. Real estate stocks fell, financials fell, consumer staples fell. In fact, more than 80% of the ASX 200 companies ended the day lower. Among the large caps, the banks were lower, the miners, as I mentioned, the large retailers were down. The exception, oil and gas giant Woodside. No surprises there.
Story number 3 is linked to that. Global oil prices surged yesterday, and Brent crude is now fetching around $82 a barrel. It's up 25% since the US first started moving its fleet to the Middle East. Market watchers warn that it could go much higher, which of course will hit people at the petrol bowser. And just to kind of put a bit of kind of a description to that, Sean, the ACCC updates its prices across the capital cities every Monday. And ahead of the latest spike, a litre of petrol in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane was well over $2 a litre. It is likely they will head towards $2.50 a litre in coming days, and possibly as much as $3. And suddenly you've got a 50-litre petrol tank, you fill it once a week, that's a $150 cost.
Yeah, cost of living, ouch. Happening everywhere. Donald Trump's very aware of that risk, what that means for the US economy. So yesterday he said the US would escort oil tankers through the Strait of Hormuz if necessary. Now that passage transports about 20% of the world's oil, but saying it and doing it are very different things. Lots of pressure on oil prices, given it's the main energy used in transporting of goods around the world. High oil prices doesn't just hit petrol bowser, but ultimately other goods and services.
Okay, story number 4, Sean. Fighting in the Middle East, as we've been talking about, continues to escalate, with Israeli and US missiles hitting Tehran yesterday, while Iran was firing at targets right across the Middle East in retaliation for the attacks that started over the weekend. Critically, reports from Iranian non-state media claim that the late Supreme Leader's second son, Moshtaba Khamenei, has now been elected to succeed his father and become the new Supreme Leader.
That's what the report's saying. Also, over the past 24 hours, Donald Trump said the US Navy will be directed to escort the tankers. As I mentioned a moment ago, Israeli troops entered southern Lebanon as Hezbollah launched a cross-border attack. Now, the Israeli Defense Force issued an evacuation warning for 16 villages in Lebanon. Warning strikes are imminent. Back home, Foreign Affairs Minister Penny Wong announced an additional 6 crisis response teams on top of regular consular support to help Australians get out of the Middle East.
Last one, story number 5. How about this? US biotech and Biosciences, that's a mouthful, says it has published its first peer-reviewed clinical paper on an oral overdose protection approach for opioid medicines using what it calls MPAR technology as part of a growing field of anti-overdose medicines, which I just find fascinating.
Yeah, so the basic premise is pretty straightforward. A person takes the medication as directed, behaves like a normal pain pill. If they don't, too much of the product, well, it resists that overdose pathway. If this holds up, huge impacts for consumers. I mean, patients, safer access to pain relief, families, reduces risk of misuse, teenagers finding medication in cupboards and stuff like that. Like, it certainly is safer in that sense. These abuse deterrent or safety enhanced drug designs aren't just a clinical debate. Insurers are interested in them. It affects pricing power, manufacturers. Ultimately, it needs proof that they work, not promises. And this is what this US biotech is suggesting, is that it has a drug that does work. Still a long way to go, but promising.
Okay, there we go. The top 5 business stories in 5 minutes. Thank you very much, Sean.
Thanks, Michael.
It is Thursday, the 5th of March, 2026. Remember to hit follow on the podcast, as I mentioned many times now. And if 5 minutes isn't enough, you can find our longer daily show called Fear and Greed, wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Michael Thompson, and that was the Fast 5 Business News by Fear and Greed. Have a great day.